Alrighty, in this video we are going to be talking about let and const. This is, if you don't use any other features in ECMAScript 2015, I really hope that you take to heart let and const, because it fixes a massive, ridiculous issue with JavaScript that has been around since JavaScript's beginning. It's basically, they, for all intents and purposes, replace the var keyword. So before we hop in, we do need to actually be able to run our JavaScript code in a browser. So to do that, I'm going to come over here into Visual Studio Code, and I am going to go ahead and in public, I'm going to right-click, create a new file, and I'm going to call this o2variables.html, and start off with our doc type HTML and our HTML head plus body. I don't care about putting a title in here. Doesn't really matter. Doesn't really bother me. We will be putting a script tag here with a source of vendor / so it starts at the root of the domain / vendor jQuery dist jQuery.js, and let's make sure that exists, and it does. Okay, so I'll hit tab on that. Then I'm also going to put in a script for /scripts /o2variables.js. So we'll be including these two files, and that's it. Those are the only two files we're going to be including. So I'm going to hop over here into my command line, or before I do that, I guess I can go ahead and actually create the o2variables.js file. So I'm going to open up source scripts, right-click, new file. I'm going to do o2variables.js, and we'll just do a console log hey, just to make sure it gets loaded. After I do that, I'm going to hop back over into my command line window, and I'm going to type in start cmd so that I have two command line windows in the same directory. Again, if you aren't using Windows, you'll have to use another method of opening two terminals up in the same directory. And on the second command line, I'm going to go ahead and pop into public, cd public, and then I'm going to type in HTTP server. So we now have our server running. For the duration of this section, I'm going to have this HTTP server open on our public directory, so bear that in mind. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to type in npm run scripts watch. This is another thing I'm going to have open for pretty much the duration of this section. I do want to point out, so I'm not going to keep on reminding you guys about having the watch open and running while we're going through all these examples, but I will, I'll just say it now, make sure it's running. If you don't see your code getting transpiled, then that means there was an error or a bug or something, and your watch task stopped working. So make sure your watch task is working. All right, I'm going to move that off to the side as well. And let's go ahead and pop open our localhost 8080. So now we get a directory listing. And if I open up o2variables.html and open up my, my console, I will go ahead and put docket at the bottom. And I will hop open over into console because we're mostly going to be concerned about this console window. We do see hey is being executed. And we can also see that jQuery is indeed being loaded in by accessing the jQuery variable. All right, now that we have that done, let's actually talk about variables. So I'm going to open up two panes here, and on the right-hand pane, I'm going to have my compiled code, and on the left hand, I'll have my source code. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just a really straightforward example. If I went ahead and say function func1, now in JavaScript, it's completely valid to do this. Var hey equals 10, var hey equals 20. So this is completely valid JavaScript, and it's problematic because redeclaring variables is an awful idea, and you should never do it. So one of the first things that let does is let prevents this. So what exactly is let? Well, let is a keyword that is very similar to var in a lot of ways. I mean, it declares a variable. It allows multiple variables to be declared on the same let statement. It's very similar to var, but it has a lot of interesting behaviors. It basically behaves like how var should have behaved from the start of this language. So if I said let test equals 10 and let test equals 20, you'll notice that code is complaining that you can't have two variables be declared in the same scope, and also Babel is complaining. So we got this error right here in Babel saying duplicate declaration test. So the first thing it lets us do, or first thing let lets us do, is not go out and allow us to redeclare a variable. I did forget that I was going to do this for all of our examples, so I will go ahead and do that real fast. Okay, so so that's the first thing about let. However, the second thing about let is that it has block scoping. It's a block scoped variable. It works how you would think variables would work in a language like C# or C or C++. It's block scoped. So you notice that right now I can't redeclare this variable twice. But if I was in a different block, so if I said, for example, if true, let OK equals sure. And then if I went and opened up another block and said, if true, let OK equals yay, you'll notice that this code works. So far, all we've seen with let is that it prevents us from doing bad things. That's the first thing to understand about the first use case for the let keyword is it lets us redeclare our variables within different scopes because it's a scope-based variable. And these variables will never conflict with each other. And it won't let us do this nastiness up here. So let's talk about another feature of let that actually is kind of its killer feature when we talk about the concept of block-scoped variables. So I'm going to go ahead and write a really quick example. I'm going to say for var I equals 0, I smaller than 10, I plus plus. Let's go ahead and say window.setTimeout, and I'm going to go ahead and pass in a function. And I'm going to pass in a delay of 500 milliseconds. And then inside of this, I'm going to say console log I. So what do you think the output of this program would be? Or of this little script, this little snippet? Remember, this snippet is going to be executing because we did write a self-executing function up here. So it will be this loop will be executed. But what do you think the output would be? Well, if you spent much time in JavaScript, you would correctly think that it would be... That was a lot less dramatic than I was thinking, but... it would be 10 tens. So 10 got repeated 10 times. But again, for people who might be newer to JavaScript, that might be surprising. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that in these variables are scoped to the current function. They're not scoped to the current block, and they don't get hoisted into closures. So this I that I'm referencing up here is the same I that is going to be incremented every time in the loop. But this callback does not get invoked until 500 milliseconds after. In fact, even if I set this to 0, I could come back here and hit F10 and get the same result. Because when you do window.setTimeout with a timeout of 0, it will actually queue that action to happen right after the JavaScript engine is done executing the rest of your script. So we notice that it's writing 10 times, and that's really, really unlikely the behavior you're looking for. So how does let fix that? Well, let introduces the concept of block-scoped variables. So if we were to fix this on our own, we might do something like this. I would say for var I equals 0, I smaller than 10, I plus plus. So if we didn't have let, this is how we would fix this problem. I would open up a function and say j goes into, and then a block, and then execute j with I, and then do window set timeout, passing in another closure, and then passing in 0, and then console logging out j. So if you're still looking at that code, pause the video because I'm about to hop back over into Chrome and hit refresh. Notice how now, so we still have our bad code executing, so we still get those 10 tens. But now we get the proper result. We get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 all the way to 9. So what's going on here? Why is this different? Well, again, vars are scoped to the current function. That means this I is the same I that's going to be used throughout the entirety of this self-closing function, which is a really, really big problem. So we can fix it by opening up another scope. So by opening another scope, I'm creating a function. Right? So I'm creating a, I could make this a little bit more straightforward. I can go ahead and say var func equals this, and then I could just go ahead and say func I. It would have the same result. The self-executing functions syntax sometimes strips people up, but this has the same result. So basically all I'm doing is I'm creating a new function, and then that function accepts a parameter. And that parameter is then scoped within the context of the function. You can think of the I getting frozen in the context of this closure. But this is really nasty code. Even though it's how we have to do it when we do things like this, it's still very, very nasty code. And so there has to be a better way. And let will actually allow us to do it. The semantics of let is very similar to what we have right here. So if I went and said for let I equals 0, I smaller than 10, I plus plus, I could go ahead and say window set timeout, passing in 0. I can say console log I, and then if I did that and came back over to Chrome and refreshed, notice how we now get a second iteration of that. That's happening on variables on this line right here, which I don't have. Looks like source maps aren't being loaded in. We can fix that later. The point is that our code is now working, but it's completely identical to the code that wasn't working, with the exception of var being replaced with let. So let's go ahead and take a look at how Babel actually makes this feature work on browsers that don't even know what let is. So if I scroll down and come right here, notice what Babel did. Babel took this code that I have highlighted right here and turned it into this code that I have highlighted over here. It basically did this for us. It basically did the thing that if you've spent much time with JavaScript, you've had to do all the time, creating little closures and self-executing functions, all that stuff. It's basically doing that for us for free. So when you reference a variable that's declared with let inside of a closure, that variable is going to be hoisted into that closure for you by Babel. And it's going to go out and it's going to write all the nasty code for you. So that is probably the biggest important thing about let to understand. So using let isn't going to magically fix all of the scoping issues, but it's a huge step forward. If you're using var, you should be using let instead. Now, I do not recommend you go out and copy and replace all of your existing vars with let, and the reason for that is that let isn't as permissive as var, and you might end up breaking your code. But I do highly recommend that you refactor your code to use let, over time, and that any new code that you write uses let instead of var. I don't really honestly see any use case of var anymore, except for if you're trying to do something weird or funky with JavaScript. But for most cases, you should use it because it'll just work, and it'll also prevent you from doing things that you shouldn't do in the first place. You should not declare a variable more than twice in the same scope. That is silly. There's no reason to do that. There's another interesting thing that that let does for you, and that is if I come up here and I create a, I say console log, and then I log out not defined yet. And then after that, I define not defined yet. I say not defined yet equals 10. Now this is completely valid JavaScript. Notice how not even Visual Studio Code is telling me that I'm doing something that I probably didn't intend to do. But that's because in JavaScript, when you use the function keyword or the var keyword, so when you declare a function like this function is declared, a named function like that, or you use the var keyword, JavaScript will do something called hoisting. It'll hoist the identifier. It'll make it so that anything within this function scope can now reference this variable, right? But the variable won't be defined yet. So what do you think the output will be here? If I come back into Chrome and refresh, you'll notice the output is basically nothing. Well, wait a sec, did it not compile? Oh wait, I'm dumb. All of these console logs out in the window.setTimeout are being invoked after this console.log. So the actual console.log that I have highlighted on line 37 is actually executing right here at the top. And you'll notice it says undefined. Whereas normally, if you were to go and do something like this, a variable that has not been declared at all, and refresh, you'll get a syntax error, or a reference error, which is preferable. If you try to access a variable that has not been defined, you should get an error. But with the way var works, you can access or reference a variable that has been defined later, but doesn't have a value yet because it hasn't yet reached line 39, and you don't get an error. You'll just silently get an undefined. This has been the source of many, 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 many bugs and is problematic. But fortunately, you probably guessed it by now, let does not let you do this. If I say console.log let defined, and then I say let defined equals 10, notice how Visual Studio Code will properly give me that warning. Block scope variable let defined used before its declaration. Now, unfortunately, and this might be different for you guys who might be using a later version of Babel, Babel itself will not complain, but you will get an error in an editor that understands the let semantics. This is something that's actually in the specification that you should not be able to do this. Okay, so let me go ahead and delete that code, or I'll comment it out. To get rid of that squiggly. And yeah, so that's let. Not a whole lot more to say about it. I'll repeat myself again. If you're using var, you should be using let instead. But there's actually another awesome variable type or way to declare a variable in ES2015, and that is const. So if you're familiar at all with languages that have the const keyword, you're probably familiar with the concept of const. So const is exactly like let in every way except for it's a constant variable that cannot be reassigned. So if I say const thing equals 10, I can reference that. I can say console log thing, right? And that'll work just fine. But if I said at any other point said thing equals 20, I will actually get an error from Babel saying that I am trying to reassign a variable that was declared as const. Now, you get all the other benefits from let from using const. So it's block scoped, it'll be properly hoisted and all that fun stuff, but you cannot redeclare it. Now, I want to point out that redeclaring the variable or reassigning the variable is different from mutating the variable. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say I had a const obj, and I say const obj has a name of whoa, right? So that's perfectly valid. Now, I can't do obj equals 20. That is invalid. That won't work. But I can do obj.name equals bleh if I wanted to. So it's important to note that const doesn't prevent you from mutating the value, but it does prevent you from reassigning it. Now, there's a big philosophical debate in the programming community, and that is about the mutation of objects. And it's very, very important, I personally believe, to not mutate your objects as much as possible. So I prefer to not reassign variables really ever, in most cases anyway. You have obvious exceptions like counters, like this I variable right here. Obviously it has to change, right? Because it's a counter. It goes from 0 to 9 in this case. And or 10 rather, because it'll hit 10 and then it'll exit the loop. But it's sort of a philosophical debate. There are two sides to it, but the winning side, in my opinion, is going to be to do not change the value of your variables. It makes your code more difficult to read. If I'm reading a function and I see a variable declared in a particular way, I'm going to more or less expect that variable to have the same value throughout the rest of the function. Because if ever that value is changed, then I have to start thinking about and executing the code in my head about under what circumstances is it changed, and changed to what. So it really adds a lot of mental overhead when you allow your variables to be mutated. And that's not to say that you should never allow your variables to be mutated, but it is to say that by default, you should think in terms of using const. So basically what I'm saying is that every place you can get away with it, use const. Try not to mutate your variables. Try to keep your code straightforward, clean, and not changing the state of your variables all the time throughout the course of a function. If you can't use const, use let. Now, there's one more consideration about const, is that you'll get a very, very small performance benefit in certain JavaScript implementations by using it. Of course, that doesn't apply here because we're using a transpiler that basically converts that const into a var. So we're not going to ever get any of those potential performance gains by using Babel, but once browsers start to support const natively, we very well could. But anyway, I'm going to be using const for practically every single variable that I declare, and I'm going to be using let for everything else, and I highly encourage that you do as well. You'll notice that most of the time it doesn't not affect how the code is compiled, but it does affect under what circumstances you're warned. And when it does affect how the code's compiled, it makes your code make a whole lot more sense by taking out this having to write this nasty closure to make your code work in the way that it should have worked from the start of the development of JavaScript itself. Anyway, so I'll stop my rant about that. Again, it's a polarizing issue. Some people think one way, some people think the other way, but I think the people who don't think like me are wrong, so ultimately it's up to you. Yeah, so I think that wraps up Let and Const, and we'll see you guys in the next video.